Hey, happy Monday. I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. And of course, because it's Monday, I am joined by my colleague, Will Saletan. Good morning, Will. How are you?
Good morning, Charlie. Great.
Before I do my rant about Twitter, I want to give a little bit of a PSA because we've gotten some questions on this. Some people who listen very, very closely and care very deeply about this podcast have noticed that we are starting to run some ads, and they are going, "What's up with that, Charlie?" Well, what's up with that is that we are growing and we are adding to our staff, and we are paying the bills. But here's the deal. Very, very shortly, we are going to tell you how those of you who are Bulwark Plus members can continue to get the podcast ad free. So, for those of you who have not actually joined, if you're a Bulwark Plus member, you have access to a bunch of stuff like the secret podcast. There's two secret podcasts. I do one with Mona Charen. And on Fridays, Sarah Longwell and JVL do a completely uncensored, off the leash podcast. The Next Level podcast on Wednesdays. There's also Across the Movie Aisle with Sunny Bunch, and of course the Thursday night Bulwark live stream. So the ad-free editions will be this podcast, Beg to Differ with Mona Charen, and of course Sarah Longwell's must listen to podcast, The Focus Group. So stay tuned for all of that. And again, for those of you who are not Bulwark Plus members, this podcast will continue to be free. And we certainly hope that you listen to our spots, because we are very, very grateful to our sponsors for enabling us to continue to do what we are doing and to do it better. Okay, so Will, I'm going to just have a 30-second rant here, which will probably go longer because that's the way rants are. So my newsletter this morning is, I think it's more than 2,000 words long, and it's about a never again Trump coalition, which is obviously going to be different from the Never Trump coalition because it will have to include people who were like, yeah, sometimes Trump, or even some of the enablers of Trump who, now are saying, hey, this guy really should not be put back in the Oval Office. And I have all sorts of caveats, including basically my daily fuck Bill Barr note. In fact, I refer to him as a serial lying twat who has destroyed his credibility. So, of course, I'm being inundated on Twitter by people. Well, Charlie, what about Bill Barr? Bill Barr says he's going to vote for Donald Trump in 2024. I deal with that in the piece. And part of the piece is to say, look, this is going to trigger a lot of gag reflexes, and we have to have a serious discussion of what is the binary choice. The binary choice now, it's not Biden versus Trump. It's never again Trump or Trump. And I think that people need to come to grips with all of that. But I suppose, look, I've already gone past 30 seconds, but it is apparently too much to expect that people will actually read an article before they tweet on it. But I would just before you write me and say, well, Charlie, Bill Barr, yeah, Bill Barr is in a class by himself. And I've established my fuck Bill Barr, definitely do not buy his book. But also, it is an extraordinary moment when you have a twice impeached, disgraced, defeated former president seeking to regain power. And the number of people who have, quote unquote, broken with him include his vice president, attorney general, two secretaries of defense, his secretary of state, two former chiefs of staff, two national security advisors, secretary of the Navy, his own communications director, his own press secretary, his own members of the cabinet. I don't think we've ever seen this before. So I would just suggest that people might want to just check this out. So, Will, that's my rant.
It's a good rant. It's a good rant. And I am in favor of the Never Again coalition. And we can tie this together with what's going on in the news because the invasion of Ukraine and land war in Europe is kind of a reminder that this is a time to start to get serious about who our enemies are and to make some compromises about who our allies are, right? So I think I'm willing to ally with anyone in that Never Again Trump coalition to make sure that that guy stays out of power.
See, I am really glad to hear you say that because I think that compared to others at the Bulwark, I'm kind of a squish. But now I can at least say, okay, I'm a squish, but I'm not as much of a squish as Will. Okay, so this is helpful for me. Well, no, this is the context that we're talking about, and one of the reasons I was thinking of writing it today is not only the fact that you have Mike Pence, who is tiptoeing toward saying that there's no room in the party for Putin apologists. Well, come on, say his name at some point, but tiptoes. But right now, these amazing stories that are just dominating everything. the incredible brutality of what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine, the commission of war crimes, the fact that he is bringing the world up to the possible edge of a world war. At the same time, we're seeing this remarkable revitalization of NATO, the Western alliance getting its act together in a way that was extremely unpredictable and it continues to be remarkable on a daily basis. I mean, when you see the Danes saying we're going to raise our defense spending, when you see the Germans doing all of this, it is remarkable. But this is the insight point here. I mean, why the context here is there's only one thing I think necessary to shatter all of this new unity, and only one thing to help Vladimir Putin snatch geopolitical victory from this current embarrassment, and that is the return to power of his soulmate, Donald Trump. You put Donald Trump back in the White House, and NATO, that this whole moment of strength and unity of NATO is cracked. And Vladimir Putin now suddenly has his number one global enabler back in a position of power. That is the one thing that we face at the moment. And that's why I thought it was time to think, okay, even those of you who might not have recognized the wisdom of Never Trump, could you at least sign on to Never Again Trump?
Yeah, that's well said. I agree with all of that. And, it's a little bit ironic that Vladimir Putin is trying to install a puppet government in Ukraine, and and everybody agrees that that would be nuts and no one would put up with it. But that's nothing. That is absolutely nothing compared to reinstalling a puppet government in the United States, which is basically what he had for 4 years.
Okay, so in this context, before we get into a lot of other stuff, and I want to talk to you about the no-fly zone, whether giving jets to the Ukrainians, whether or not we should impose a Russian oil embargo, all of that stuff, because I think this ties into all of this. Over the weekend, someone named Douglas McGregor went on Fox News. He was on with Stuart Varney, and he basically was channeling the latest Russian propaganda. Liz Cheney called him out on this, but I want to play a little bit of this because it's important to hear what he says, and then to remember who this guy is and why this is relevant. So again, let's play a little bit of a soundbite of this guy, Douglas McGregor, former Trump intimate. I just give it away a little bit here. Nominated by Donald Trump as ambassador to Germany. This was his comments on Fox News over the weekend.
The first 5 days, Russian forces, I think, frankly, were too gentle. They've now corrected that. So I would say another 10 days, this should be completely over. But the question is, what is it that Zelensky is going to do? The Russians have made it very clear what they want is a neutral Ukraine. This could have ended days ago if he accepted that. And then they can adjust the borders. But the eastern part of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. But again, the Russians are not seizing territory. They're destroying Ukrainian forces. That's their focus.
Colonel, it sounds like you don't approve of Zelensky's stand.
Oh, I think Zelensky is a puppet. And he is putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk. And quite frankly, most of what comes out of Ukraine is debunked as lies within 24 to 48 hours. The notions of taking and retaking airfields, all of this is nonsense. It hasn't happened.
He's not a hero when he's standing up for himself and his own people. You don't think he's a hero?
No, I do not. I don't see anything heroic about the man. And I think the most heroic thing that he can do right now is to come to terms with reality.
Wow. By which he means neutralize Ukraine. So, Will, this is a guy who comes on the air, talks about how gentle the Russian forces are, but they've corrected it now because now they're actually killing civilians. Apparently.
Right. Too gentle, he said. They were too gentle.
Too gentle. I mean, you think that Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham were deplorable? I mean, this guy is okay. What's important to understand about this guy is that he was Trump's nominee to be ambassador to Germany, and Axios had a report about him. How he had met with Trump for an hour-long Oval Office meeting in April 2020, and the men bonded instantly when the meeting ended. Trump told McGregor, "I want you working for me. We will find a way." And he really warmed up to McGregor. Now, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, always considered McGregor irrational, edging on all-out lunacy. But remember in the last few months of his presidency, Trump personally tapped McGregor to be senior advisor to the acting Secretary of State and put him in charge of overseeing the withdrawal of American troops from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and other places around the globe. So this is somebody that Donald Trump looked at and said, this is my guy. I want to put him in positions of power. And the reason I'm bringing this up again is in a Trump 2.0 administration, who is he going to tap? Who will be willing to work with him? It will be guys like this, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, and what people need to understand about guys like this is this was going on throughout the Trump administration. There was a fight for Donald Trump's allegiance between Vladimir Putin and people who supported Vladimir Putin, like McGregor, right? And on the other hand, these hawks in Congress and the Senate, and in the Trump national security team, right? And they were vying for the loyalty of Donald Trump the whole time. Some of them still support Trump, like Lindsey Graham, and some of them, like John Bolton, have ditched Trump. But they all agreed that they could not rely on Donald Trump, and that this was a fight for his soul. The other thing about this guy McGregor is this character is not new, right? There have been previous wars where the United States was on one side, and there was always some American who represented the bad guys and who would do propaganda for the bad guys. And what's kind of new here is that McGregor is not like isolated. He hasn't been like just confined to RT. He's been on Fox, and not on Fox the way we just heard him, as an adversary, as somebody expressing the wrong, immoral point of view. He was on Tucker Carlson, and he was the guy with whom Carlson had a colloquy, a couple of months ago, talking about how the Biden administration compared to the Russians, that the Putin administration was Christian, that the Biden administration wasn't. And Carlson was in full agreement with him. So this view has been mainstreamed, if we can call it that, within right-wing media, within Fox News.
Now, at least for the moment, Tucker Carlson is trying to retcon his defenses of Vladimir Putin. Did you happen to catch the SNL, the Saturday Night Live?
Oh, yes.
Cold open. Okay, I certainly do not want to make light of any of this, but it is worth noting not only are people like Tucker Carlson isolated from American public opinion, maybe even from conservative public opinion right now, but people are laughing at them, not with them. Okay, let's just play a little bit from the SNL clip.
And now, live from Mar-a-Lago, it's the Fox News Ukrainian Invasion Celebration Spectacular with your hosts, Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tucker Carlson. I'm like if a pair of boat shoes came to life.
And I'm Laura Ingraham, and when I watch Harry Potter, I root for Voldemort.
Now, Laura, we got into a little bit of trouble for all the nice things we said about Russia and the mean things we said about Ukraine.
Right. We did sound pretty awful in hindsight and foresight.
Yeah. I kept asking, why do we hate Putin? Aren't liberals in America even worse?
Right, and I called the president of Ukraine pathetic. He stayed and fought with his people in the war, and I called him pathetic from a news desk in Washington.
Yeah. I kept saying we should be more worried about our own border getting invaded by Mexico. But in my defense, I am racist, so I thought that was true.
But tonight, we're going to make it up to you. We're raising money for the real victims of this invasion, the oligarchs. Because we need to...
Yeah, it's going to be worth replaying what these folks say when they try to drop it into the memory hole, right, Will?
Yeah, and they were getting away with this until people started dying, right? They were wrong. Ingraham was wrong. Carlson was wrong. They were on the wrong side, and they thought they would get away with it because there's this attitude at Fox News and a lot of places like that this is all fun and games. That we're doing gags, we're doing entertainment for our audience, and we're whatever the other side is for, we're against. So we're going to like dally with Putin and that kind. And then the shelling begins, and people are dying, and everybody's watching this on their TV sets, and suddenly the evil is manifest in a way that's deeply embarrassing to these folks, and they're backtracking. But they shouldn't be forgiven for having not taken it seriously until that moment.
We've talked about people who have been, maybe breaking with Trump is too strong a word. I don't think so. But edging away from Trump, you have Mike Pence, who was the ultimate loyalist, now saying there's no room in the Republican Party for Putin apologists, which of course is not true, since the Republican Party is still completely in the thrall of Donald Trump, who intends to be the nominee for president again in a couple of years. So he's pushing back on Trump's position. You also have John Bolton. I have a soundbite from him in a moment. I wanted to get your thoughts about Nikki Haley, who continues to be, I know it's gotten old to say it's amazing. When you listen to some of the things she said back in 2016, the way she was regarded, the fact that she broke with him for at least, 5 minutes after January 6th. Well, she's on Meet the Press yesterday and ripping the Biden administration for asking for help from China. Let's just play a little bit of this, and then I want to get your reaction, Will, on the other side.
You can't trust Xi. You can't trust China. It's common sense. I dealt with them at the United Nations. You never negotiate. You never deal with your enemies. You can't trust them. And that's why I was mortified that Biden went so far as asking China for help with Russia. I mean, you never ask an enemy for help with another enemy.
Will.
I don't know where to begin with this.
How about World War II? How about the history of World War II? Maybe.
It's the entire history of geopolitics, the history of war, the entire history is dealing with your enemies to fight against your other enemies. That's the way the world is set up. Also, this was her job. I mean, she was the UN ambassador. She literally did this, by the way, right? She worked with the Chinese and the Russians to get sanctions on the North Koreans because she knows better. She knows that that's the job. And what's amazing is that she'll go on TV, and it wasn't just this interview. This wasn't a one-off. She did the same thing on Fox the same day. And so there seems to be this idea among people who understand foreign policy in the Republican Party that the rubes, meaning their voters, are stupid. And so they're going to talk to them in this way, like, well, you never deal with an enemy against another enemy, knowing full well that they're lying.
Well, that's it. It's clear that she's not this dumb. And yet apparently they're searching around for some sort of a talking point here. So they'll just throw this stuff up against the wall. Okay, so the other, of course, narrative that is very popular on the right is that this never would have happened. This invasion never would have happened if Donald Trump had been in office, because Donald Trump was so tough on Vladimir Putin, and so therefore he deterred it. John Bolton, who is deplorable in his own ways, and of course waited to dish on Trump in a book rather than testify before the impeachment inquiry. I mean, I want to make sure that we have all those caveats in order. John Bolton has some thoughts on Trump and Putin. Let's listen to him.
One last question. In your memoir, you wrote that President Trump wanted to leave NATO in 2018. How close did that come to reality? And we have just a minute left.
Yeah, I had my heart in my throat at that NATO meeting. I didn't know what the president would do. He called me up to his seat seconds before he gave his speech, and I said, look, go right up to the line, but don't go over it. I sat back down. I had no idea what he'd do. I thought he put his foot over it, but at least he didn't withdraw then. In a second Trump term, I think he may well have withdrawn from NATO. And I think Putin was waiting for that.
So, Will, just another reason why never again Trump, the consequences of putting him back in the White House. If you ever wanted a stark example of it, it's playing out right now. And I don't know whether anything actually ever moves the needle or changes anything or makes a difference, but the relevance of our support for NATO seems exponentially greater today than it might have a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a year ago. What do you think?
Absolutely. I'm stuck. I'm haunted by those last words from Bolton. Putin was waiting for that. He was waiting for Trump to withdraw from NATO. Trump was Putin's tool for destroying NATO. I mean, there's this view on the right, Charlie, that's represented by Trump and some others, that Putin is this kind of genius and everything he does is brilliant. He's a great chess player, yada, yada. Obviously, what we're looking at is a failed invasion. This is not going the way that Putin wanted it to go. So how do we square that? And I think the answer is this invasion, the way it's going, this was not what Putin had in mind. It's partly that the Ukrainians are fighting back, but it's partly the unity of the free world, the unity of NATO.
It's really amazing.
Yeah, and that is exactly what would have been different. One big reason why this invasion is not going the way that Putin wanted it to is because the first part of his strategy, which was to have a puppet in the United States named Donald Trump in his second term, who would be, have withdrawn from NATO or would have ripped NATO apart, that failed, and that allowed the NATO to unify in the face of this invasion. And that's really important to understand how Trump fit into Putin's original plan for what he was going to do in Ukraine.
And Putin made a calculation, whether it was a rational calculation, we'll leave it up to others to decide, but he made the calculation that the West would react to the invasion of Ukraine the way they had reacted to his horrors in the past. He had watched the appeasement. He had watched as the West dithered and sort of, wrist slapped him after seizing Crimea, after the atrocities in Syria. And I think he made the calculations that, okay, yeah, they'll impose some sanctions, but same old, same old. We'll live with that. I think they are taken by surprise by the severity of the sanctions, by the unity of the West, by the forcefulness of this. They have to be taken by surprise by the way that civil society and the private sector is reacting. I mean, none of that would have been even imaginable 3 weeks ago. So, clearly he miscalculated. But here's my question. Maybe you can help me with this, because I know you follow this. I agree. There's no question this invasion has not gone the way that he wanted. That it is, potentially a massive fiasco. But how do we know what we know? You know the question I'm asking here? There is so much disinformation. There's so much propaganda that comes out. And I would like to say that it's all Russian disinformation, but let's face it, a lot of the things that I look at and I see and I go, do I believe that? Is that true? Is that representative? Are we telling ourselves stories that make us feel better? I mean, how confident should we be that we really understand what's going on the ground?
Well, Charlie, you're getting all Don Rumsfeld on me with
I
the
am.
unknown unknowns.
I am, yeah.
So so now we can confess. Both you and I have been in the closet about this, and now we can unite. I have been having the same experience, and I would put it this way: I follow a lot of news coming out of Ukraine. I'm following a lot of it on Twitter. It's being posted by people who claim to be journalists. But Charlie, I don't trust half of it. More than
Yeah,
half of it.
I know.
It's too good to be true. It's
Right.
just too good to be true. You're always seeing this Russian vehicle and that Russian vehicle has been destroyed, helicopters knocked down, planes knocked down. And then you look at the map and you see the Russians advancing. Now it's the invasion is failing, but what it's failing at is to control Ukraine. It's not failing to destroy Ukraine, right? That's what's happening. So I'm leery that there's such confirmation bias and such excitement about everything brave the Ukrainians do. God bless the Ukrainians for their valor, for their ingenuity, for their innovation. They're doing an amazing job. But I do not trust the ratio of good news to bad news that I am seeing.
No, and I'm trying to find the sources that are the most credible, and there are military sources who put things in context. But I think part of my concern is that people's expectations have been raised, and this could end very, very badly. And we could have I just think we're going to have a very, very ugly who lost the Ukraine debate. Now that may be premature, because I mean, this is a feisty country, and there's no question about it. The things that are very, very clear. I mean, what's happened in the West, I think, has been clear. I think the resolve of the Ukrainian people has been clear. We are also seeing the biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II. I mean, 1.5 million Ukrainians leaving. I mean, the stories watching them go into Poland. I mean, Poland has really stood up, haven't they? I mean, I'm sort of jumping around here. I mean, things that we know for sure. But, I'm listening to some of the things that President Zelensky is saying, and there's a real urgency in his demands. And he is not only rallying the Ukrainian people, but he is very, very critical of the West. He has said some very harsh things about NATO. So I guess let's dive into some of the things that he is saying are necessary. Big debate seems to be about the concept of a no-fly zone, which seems to be their number one demand. And if we will not impose a no-fly zone, he wants us to give him some jets. So give me your sense of whether the no-fly zone is a reasonable request and whether it is reasonable for NATO to say, no, we completely have your back, but we're not going to provide you any of that air support.
So I'm against the no-fly zone, and I am persuaded by the arguments made on that side. Here's the fundamental problem with the no-fly zone. In the way that we talk about it publicly, that if you poll people about a no-fly zone, what they think is that it's a defensive measure. Look, we're not shooting at anybody. We're not attacking the Russians. We're just saying you can't fly in here and kill the Ukrainians. It's just not that simple. A no-fly zone is not simply a defensive measure, right? You have to be willing to shoot down other planes. You have to be willing to possibly to take out anti-aircraft batteries that some of which aren't even in Ukraine. They're in Russia. They're in Belarus. It gets real complicated real fast, and you have a risk of escalation. And there are better alternatives that we can pursue, but basically to allow the Ukrainians to do it their own way. But underlying all of this is this awful moral calculus, which is we would all like to save the Ukrainian people from this brute and from this force that is murdering them. But it may not be possible to save all of them without an escalation that could lead to many, many more
Yeah.
deaths, right? And meanwhile, without being able to save all of them, we have a much higher likelihood of being able to make this invasion so expensive for Putin, such an obvious mistake, possibly costing him his job or even his life, not at our hands, but at the hands of his own people around him, as a result of just like making this a failure for him. And that failure does not necessarily entail being able to save all of these wonderful people who are being driven from their homes. So it's a tragedy, but it's part of the awful moral calculus of war.
All right, I'm going to come back to that question. What about giving them the jets?
What's going on there is it's a little bit complicated because you have Ukrainian pilots who know how to fly certain kinds of planes, and they're
Right.
not our planes, right? So
Right.
they know how to fly the planes, the Soviet planes, like that the Poles have and the Slovaks have, and so forth. And so obviously there's a game going on behind the scenes. It's awful to use the word game, but the game is that we're going to try to encourage the Poles, for example, to provide their MiGs to the Ukrainians who can then fly them. They know how to fly them. And then we so-called backfill. We provide the Poles with our F-16s, and that substitutes in. And so it's a transaction where we're basically supplying lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, but pretending that it's coming from somebody else.
So how old are these MiGs? I was looking around for this answer. I mean, the Soviet Empire fell at the end of the 80s, and yet the Poles are still flying MiGs? I mean, were they still buying them? I mean, why are they still flying MiGs?
I do not know. And Charlie, this is part of this weird thing with Ukraine. Like I'm not a military expert, but like one of the things that I've learned from all of the news and all of the about Ukraine is the, having the latest weaponry is great, but it's way more important that you were able to match weaponry with people who know how to use it, right? And so weirdly, some of the older equipment, it's not just the planes. There's just like shoulder fired missiles, and there's Kalashnikovs, whatever weapon you can get to the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians can use today because they need to save their own lives today is more important than getting them something that requires a manual or some 2 weeks of training that they just don't have.
Okay, so I want to ask you another big question, another big decision that the administration has to make within probably the next several days. But let's hear a word from our sponsor first. Here's something you should pay attention to. Homeowners who have not taken advantage of today's low interest rates are overpaying for their mortgage. Make sure that's not you. It just takes a 10-minute call to my friends at American Financing, America's home for home loans, where you'll get a free no obligation mortgage review from a salary-based mortgage consultant. So there's no pressure. And you're not paying any upfront or hidden fees. You're just learning about the different ways that you can save up to $1,000 a month. That's right, a month. Think of what you can do with that kind of money, the kind of difference it can make to your budget. Then make the call to American Financing to learn more, and do it now before rates rise. You could end up skipping up to 2 payments and may close in as fast as 10 days. Call 888-991-9788. That's 888-991-9788, or visit americanfinancing.net/thrill. NMLS 182334, NMLSconsumeraccess.org. Okay, we're back with Will Saletan. Okay, so Will, you're talking about the possible escalation that may cost more lives in Ukraine. The strongest argument against, of course, a no-fly zone. Won't there be the same calculation if the Russians move into Moldova? And are we willing to actually risk World War III for Estonia? I mean, these calculations, I mean, we're all saying, well, we're not going to do it for Ukraine. Won't our arguments obtain with these other countries if Vladimir Putin pushes into Moldova, which is not a member of NATO, or even into Estonia, which is?
I mean, there's separate arguments for the two cases. In the case of the NATO countries, these signals were sent well before the invasion, right? The Biden administration said very clearly, you step into a NATO country and you're at war, right, with us, where we're going to defend every inch of NATO territory. So that would cover the Estonians. You get to other countries that are not part of NATO, you're up to at that point you're in more of a logistical argument that the Russians clearly have bitten off more than they can chew in Ukraine. The idea that they're going to go into Moldova, which, I mean, what's actually going to happen here is they are going to collapse or fray in Ukraine. They're not going to be able to hold the territory that they've already taken, and we'll see how much that ends up being. So they could go into Moldova if they have more of a suicide wish. But I don't see them having the resources. I don't see them having the resources to pursue that.
This is the most interesting question to me, is what is the next step? Let's, for the sake of argument, and I'm not assuming this is going to happen, but let's assume that the Russians do take all of the major cities, that they do decapitate the government, not necessarily kill everybody, but they declare that they've conquered Ukraine. Well, then they have Ukraine. And Ukraine is a very, very big country. And clearly 190,000 soldiers, may be enough to destroy the Ukrainian army, but it is not enough to occupy and hold Ukraine. What happens then? This is the thing that, in terms of like major miscalculations, what is Vladimir Putin's end game there? Because Ukraine strikes me as one of the last countries on earth you'd want to be occupying at the moment.
Yeah, I don't see an end game for Putin other than at this point trying to cut his losses and get some kind of a written agreement, right? He's going to, in other words, take as much territory as he can, claim that he holds this much ground, and then try to use that, try to bargain with it while he has it, because he can't keep it. He absolutely can't keep it, and he must know that. He must know by now he doesn't have either the quantity or the quality of troops to hold that ground, given the size of Ukraine, given the population, given how well they fought. And he's up against an insurgency that would just continue to bleed his forces. And obviously, the sanctions are bleeding his country. He's got to end all that. I mean, if there's any rational way out, it's got to be an agreement. And honestly, Charlie, I am torn about whether to make an agreement with him, which would save some lives if it would just stop the fighting. On the other hand, I do not want in any way to reward this guy for having proceeded with this grotesque invasion and having murdered so many people. We have to make this so painful and such a clear loss for him that it deters future aggression so that he doesn't go into Moldova, so he doesn't go into Estonia.
So the biggest infliction of pain would, of course, be an embargo on the purchase of Russian oil, which the Biden administration had basically rejected last week because they're concerned about what it would do for inflation, for the cost of gasoline at the pump. There seems to be tremendous bipartisan momentum right now to impose some sort of an embargo. Good idea or not? I mean, that strikes me as kind of the death penalty for the Russian economy, if we have not already imposed it.
Yeah, no, we have to cut. And let's be honest. The reason we haven't cut off the oil is because of us. It's not because of him, right? We are addicted. We are addicted to the oil, and we got to break the addiction. And I keep wanting to scream about this. This is such an obvious case for a bipartisan, cross-ideological agreement, at least within the United States. I can't speak for the politics of Europe, but within the United States, there is, I mean, Russia is, as John McCain said, a gas station pretending to be a country, right? And you have to cut that off. How do you cut it off? Well, in the short term, the conservatives have it right. We need more oil from other sources, including us, right? We should absolutely, have oil-friendly policies in the short term. And in exchange for that, and oh, by the way, we need nuclear, another thing that the left has been wrong about. But in exchange for that, we have to accept where the left has been correct. And that is a long-term and as fast as possible transition to non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And there's a lot of infrastructure. A lot of the stuff that was in the Build Back Better bill, which was under the rubric of climate, this would be extremely useful for energy independence. Cut the knees out from under this gas station, Russia, by shifting the United States to non-fossil fuel sources of energy.
Okay, so right now, Republicans are saying we're on board with this if you want to cut off gas purchases from Russia, even if it means inflation. But I don't know, am I being too cynical to think that there's going to be a pivot and that within a couple of months, high gas prices will once again be Republicans' number one talking point?
Oh, Charlie, they're already there.
Yeah,
They're
I know.
already there.
But at the same time, the cognitive dissonance is not a problem for them.
They're trying to thread that needle where they don't look like Putin apologists, but they're it's Joe Biden's fault. We're not saying that Putin's not to blame exactly, but sort of we are, right? This is the fault of Joe Biden's terrible Ukraine policy, European policy. He failed to do whatever, and therefore your gas prices are going up. And they totally want to milk this because this has been part of the Republican 2022 campaign message, right? It's like the gas prices are too high,
Yeah.
and they're going to go higher. And so, I mean, what we need, obviously, is this is an economic war. We're trying to defeat Russia without sending our own troops to die, right? And we're doing that through economic sanctions. So the sacrifice that we have to make as Americans is economic. It is, yeah, your gas is going to go higher in price if we cut off the Russian oil. And we have to decide as a country that we're going to unify around that sacrifice. And that is the opposite of what a lot of these Republican politicians are doing.
Yeah, this is. I think that anyone who thinks that this moment of bipartisanship is going to last has been incredibly naive for all of this. I think we saw this in the first few days when you would have expected the maximum impulse for presenting a unified front, right? And of course, we didn't get that. We saw what happened at the State of the Union, and I think we can get this. Give me your sense, though, of the way Biden is handling it. Let me give you my short version, is that this is both the strength and the weakness of the Biden presidency. I think behind the scenes, he's been handling this in a really surprisingly masterful way, pulling together the alliances, orchestrating, many of the moves, letting other people take the lead. So that's been very, very effective, and I think in some ways surprisingly effective. On the other hand, I think that he is not making the public case as effectively as he needs to. If in fact he does stop buying oil from Russia, does impose an embargo, I think he needs to have an Oval Office primetime address to the American people where he explains that move and does not engage in happy talk, but says, look, this is going to hurt. This is going to require sacrifice. And this is why it is necessary. This is why we are doing it. And I think this has been the weak spot. He's very effective behind the scenes. He is not an effective user of the bully pulpit. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate, but the president of the United States is a bad talker. He's just a bad talker. He's not clear. He's not loud. He's not persistent. He's withdrawn. And there are moments when he could do it. I mean, the State of the Union. I don't know if you had the same experience I did. I'm watching the State of the Union, and he gets to the part about the gas prices, and there was something about and I'm waiting for him to say, and we all need to get ready because our gas prices are going to be more expensive, and and instead he says something about, oh, I'm going to try to make sure that this doesn't hurt you. That is not the way to prepare your country for sacrifice.
Right.
We had this right during, what was it, after 9/11? Bush said something similar about like there's just
Go back to the mall.
Yes, that's what it was, right? And it's not going to be that way. Not if you're going to win this war.
I do wonder. I must say that I am fascinated by the impact that Volodymyr Zelensky is having on the world. His courage, the way he has shamed the West into taking a stand. I wonder if he's also helping to redefine leadership, because I think we'd kind of forgotten what it sounded like to have a leader who would lead from not from behind but from the front, who would be honest and open and candid about the sacrifices that are necessary. And you can see the kind of role model impact that someone like a Donald Trump has had. But you wonder whether or not Zelensky is also providing a role model image that might inspire Joe Biden to say, okay, you know what, maybe people will listen to a warrior president, because I think he's afraid. I think he's almost apologetic about that sort of thing.
Well, the word I keep thinking about for the time that we're living in, meaning the last couple of weeks, is adversity. Real adversity,
Yeah,
real
right.
evil, real. I mean, that completely changes the context. All of the all of the unseriousness, the jokiness of, people like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham suddenly looks small and ridiculous and sad. And this is also true of leadership, right? I mean, Zelensky he was an actor, he was a comedian, and real adversity comes, real evil, and devastation, and in that context, against that, you see what a man is made of. And what you see in his case is courage, right? You see, I need ammunition, not a ride. You see him staying, and
If
he
he if he
knows.
if he really said that, by the way, but that's another one of those.
Well, that's true. That's a good question.
I mean, this is the hard part about it, is all the stories you really love. You go, did that really happen? Did he really say that? Apparently, that's an apocryphal quote.
That would be very funny and apt, right? Because let's be honest, he's still acting, right? And I don't say acting, like he's still talking to an audience and trying to convey a message that will influence them. He is trying to rally his people to save their country, right? And he knows that it's not just that if he's brave and stays there, but if he makes videos, if he talks, if he presents himself as a model of what they must do, he will inspire them. And he has done that, right? So it's a little bit of a mixture of the seriousness of the content of what's going on, plus the talent, the knowledge of, as a performer, of how his behavior will influence and inspire others.
So, on the subject of the serious and the absurd, your thoughts about the People's Convoy? This was going to be the big story, where there was going to be this truck convoy that would go around the Beltway to protest. It's unclear exactly what they are still protesting. Some sort of vaccine mandate. It just appears to be kind of this free-form Trumpistic sense of grievances. Your thoughts on the People's Convoy? Bust what? I mean,
it's
not.
Yeah, I thought of it as an anti-vax thing because it was inspired by sort
Yeah.
of rebellion against mandates, all kinds of mandates, vaccines, masks, people telling us what to do. And, you get this ridiculous rhetoric of like, this is communism, this is fascism. Meanwhile, there's an actual invasion, going on, run by an authoritarian, and like there's people being murdered. And so it's another one of these things that looks very small. It's almost as though like, if this could have been stopped and some intelligent PR person had been in charge of it, right, they would have said, let's not do this right now, guys, because obviously the real fascism, the real totalitarianism is not happening here in the West, right? It's happening over there. But they went through with it, and I just think it makes them look pathetic and ridiculous.
I think so too, but you're right. There was no way that they were going to, slam on the brakes. And I think this is, one of the consequences of living in these alternative reality silos, that they were able to sort of ignore the absurd juxtaposition of, the convoys that you have in Ukraine versus what they're protesting, and particularly since all of the mandates seem to be going away, right? I mean, it's just like you're protesting something that doesn't exist anymore, even if it was a legitimate protest, which it's really not. So apparently, I mean, the latest I'm seeing is they were going to circle the Beltway again on Monday, but they postponed it. I mean, maybe there is some backing off on it. It's always hard to tell with these things.
Yeah, and this is part of like, it's not just the convoy, it's the whole Dr. Seussification of politics, right? And I think of this, look, I'm coming from the left side of the spectrum, so I'm thinking about the right. I'm sure someone can tell me this is happening on the left too, but you construct these stupid little cultural fights over something like Dr. Seuss, and you milk them on Fox News for like as many news cycles as you can, and they're manufactured. They're manufactured because you don't have anything serious to talk about, and you won't talk about the serious things out there. And then when a serious thing happens, it just underscores the folly and the insult to your readers and your viewers that these stupid little manufactured issues represent.
So since I've been so focused on Ukraine all weekend, is there something else that you're paying attention to? Is there something else that we should be watching right now? Because I really am having a hard time. I mean, I know that I can think about more than one thing at a time, but this is so dominant. What else should we be watching?
So I've been kind of watching the Mitch McConnell Rick Scott fight over whether
Oh, yeah.
Senator Scott has like put forward this agenda, right? He's got this idea that like to take people back. 1994, the Republicans believe they're going to take over Congress, which they were, and they want to do this contract with America, so they can claim a mandate when they go in. But they sensibly wait until very late in the game to do this, because you don't actually want voters to be thinking about, wait a minute, do we want this out party to come in and do this stuff we don't agree with? You just want them to be thinking about how much they hate the in party.
Right.
And so Rick Scott is coming out with this stuff in February, March. This is way, way too early. And McConnell knows this is crazy. Like, Scott is like, everyone should pay some taxes, even the poor. Okay, you can make that argument, in some economic theory way, but like that's politically incredibly stupid, and McConnell knows it. So he wants Scott and those guys to just shut up. But Scott is like, no, let's get out there and tell people what we'll do. There is no greater gift that the Republicans could give to the Democrats than to come out with an agenda with stuff like tax the poor and put that out months and months in advance of the election.
Yeah, it's a reminder that Rick Scott is not that smart, but he's clearly doubling down. So what is his agenda? Does he think that he might become majority leader? Does he have other ambitions? I mean, there's something else going on here.
My cynical theory, he's raising money off this. He's raising money off of getting his name out there and like, here's my website, and I think he's building his name ID and his brand and yada, yada. And as you say, he's a stupid man. And I don't believe he's thought this through as an actual strategy for the party. But if he thinks the party is going to win anyway, maybe he's doing this Newt Gingrich game from 1994. And he's going to claim that there's a mandate for a lot of stuff in his agenda if the Republicans win.
I think that's probably fair. So, Will Saletan, thank you for joining me again on the podcast. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.
Hey, it's Rich Eisen, and my first guest of season 3 of Just Getting Started happens to be the new host of this podcast, my better half, Susie Schuster. You've got one of the most unique stories of how you got started, so why don't you come across the hall, take the chair, and oh boy, wait a minute, I think I locked the door. That's not a metaphor for anything.
How's the lighting in here? I mean, I'm vain, So I thought for the first season, try to bring you people I thought were diverse and different and maybe interesting, and that's why I started off with Jeffrey Ross, the comedian. And then, we've got a bunch of other asks out, making Paul Rudd do it. Sorry, Paul, do you know that you're doing it? And I want this to be inspirational. Life is really hard right now, and sometimes you just need a little bit of help, someone to reach out their hand and pull you along, or to push you from behind and say, you can do this. And I'm hoping that's what you're going to get from Just Getting Started.
Go follow Just Getting Started wherever you get your favorite shows.